31st of October, 2000. The last Halloween night of the 20th century ended with a bang. A Singapore Airlines 747 was on its routine flight from Singapore's Changi Airport to Los Angeles, with a stopover at Taiwan. At 11 o'clock at night, after having that stopover, the plane was about to take off, and it just rolled down the runway. But they had a problem. The weather in Taiwan was extremely bad because of a typhoon. But nobody worried, and everyone thought the three experienced pilots would manage the takeoff beautifully. But just within seconds, right after all the passengers got ready for takeoff, buckling their seatbelts, the plane met a horrible fate and was caught in a devastating fire. 83 people died on the spot, just because those experienced pilots took a wrong turn. But how could the pilots knowingly take a wrong turn? This question puzzled investigators for a long time. In a deeper investigation, turns out, it's always easy to blame pilots at first. But if aviation safety were only about pilot skill, Singapore Airlines Flight 006 would have never crashed. This is the pathetic story of Singapore Airlines Flight 006. And in this video, we'll unpack the chain of errors that led to 3 elite pilots making a deadly mistake, which ended up in a merciless disaster. It was a stormy Halloween night in Taiwan. Singapore Airlines Flight 006, named Megatop, was waiting to take off from Taipei, Taiwan, heading to Los Angeles. The plane was a Boeing 747, one of the biggest and most advanced passenger aircraft of its time. It carried 159 passengers and 17 flight attendants. The captain, Foong Chee Kong, was 41 years old and highly experienced. He had flown for over 11,000 hours. Beside him were 2 first officers, Latiff Cyrano and Kheng Leng. Together, they were trusted to guide hundreds of people safely through that stormy night. But it was not just a random storm, it was one of the worst storms that had hit Taipei in years. Typhoon Xangsane. That time, it was about 350 kilometers away. But its strong winds and heavy rain were already shaking the airport. The wind speed reached 75 knots, which is nearly 140 kilometers per hour. The gusts were even stronger, enough to make large aircraft shake on the ground. But inside the cockpit, everything felt calm and controlled. Singapore Airlines was always known for its safety, precision, and discipline. Even their pilots are all highly trained. So the passengers inside the plane trusted that nothing could go wrong. The pilots had already checked all their flight documents. They read through weather updates and safety notices known as NOTAMS. These notices tell pilots about any changes or hazards at airports. And one of them mentioned that a runway at Taiwan's Chiang Kai-shek International Airport was closed for construction. This airport had 3 runways, and 2 of them were long and used for large aircraft. And the third one, runway 05 right, was a bit of an odd case. It was actually built from an old taxiway, which is basically a narrow strip for aircraft to move on the ground, not take off. Plus, it was too close to the terminal. So large planes parked nearby made this third runway even more dangerous. For those reasons, over time, pilots stopped using it for takeoff or landing. And by the year 2000, the airport had already decided to convert it back into a taxiway. But things didn't go as planned. There were construction delays, and for that, this runway still had lights, markings, and signs that made it look like a real runway. Only part of it was blocked off in the middle, where workers had dug up the surface and parked construction vehicles. The rest of it, especially the end closest to the terminal, looked normal, like any usable runway. Now, Singapore Airlines Flight 006 was scheduled to take off from 05 left runway, which runs parallel to the third one. Not only that, but both runways also started from the same general area and pointed in almost the same direction. In daylight, pilots could easily tell them apart. But that night, under heavy rain and fierce winds, things would look extremely different. Inside the cockpit, Captain Foong reminded his crew not to rush. It was actually him who planned to use runway 05 left, because it was longer and safer in wet conditions. So finally, at 11:07 at night, the plane began to roll. The pilots followed a route through the maze of taxiways that led to the runway. First Officer Latiff called out directions, while the captain steered the massive aircraft through the rain. The plane moved slowly, its lights cutting through the storm. Inside, some passengers held their breath each time the wind shook the wings. The crew talked calmly about their route, Go straight down, then right, then left, all the way, Captain Foong said. They double-checked each turn. They knew that in weather like this, one wrong turn could lead to confusion and accidents. But soon you will see, when a devastating accident happens, how it beats all the caution, alertness, and double-checks. The airport lights looked blurred under the heavy rain. This means visibility was poor and less than half a kilometer. Even the signs marking each taxiway were hard to see. When they reached a junction known as N1, there were two paths ahead. One led to the correct runway, 05 left. The other one led to the closed runway, 05 right. But in that night's extreme rain, both looked identical. And because 05 right's construction area was in the middle, the end they were facing looked clean and freshly paved, with bright runway lights still on. Now, you might easily catch that it's a mistake, but honestly, to any experienced pilot looking out through sheets of water, it seemed like the real runway. The controller told them, Singapore 6 cleared for takeoff runway 05 left. So they started turning onto what they believed was the runway 05 left. The cockpit voice recorder captured Captain Foong saying, "It's going to be slippery, I'll slow down for the turn." As the plane lined up, the runway stretched into darkness ahead. Only faint blue taxi lights and white runway lights were visible. But suddenly, First Officer Latiff noticed something strange. "The PVD hasn't lined up," he said. The PVD, or Path Vector Display, is a system that helps pilots align the plane with the correct runway direction. It shows if the plane is centered properly. Let me explain how, because it's important. When a plane lined up correctly with the runway, the PVD's shutter would open to show a spinning striped pattern, like a barber's pole. If the pattern rotated left, it meant the plane was pointing too far right. If it spun right, the plane was too far left. When the stripes stopped moving, the plane was perfectly aligned. It was a smart backup tool, especially useful when visibility was poor. But that night, when the pilots turned the jet toward what they thought was runway 05 left, the shutters didn't open. First Officer Latiff noticed immediately. He called it out. The captain, Foong, didn't seem too concerned. He thought maybe they weren't fully lined up yet. The relief pilot, Kheng, reminded them they had to be within 45 degrees of the runway for the PVDS to activate. They adjusted their heading, still nothing happened. The shutters stayed closed. Captain Foong then glanced outside. Despite the storm, he could see the runway lights ahead, and it looked fine. "Never mind," he said, "we can see the runway." The visibility then was far above the limit where the PVDS were mandatory. So they ignored the strange behavior of the instruments. It was a small, easily dismissed sign. Apart from that, everything seemed routine. The crew got clearance. The cabin crew reported ready. Foong pushed the throttles forward. The four massive engines roared, and the aircraft started rolling down the runway, gaining speed. The rain lashed the windscreen, and that time visibility dropped further. Relief pilot Kheng called out, 80 knots. Latiff confirmed. Then came V1's, the point of no return. Once a plane crosses that speed, a takeoff can no longer be aborted safely. Captain Foong's voice came again, calm but focused. "Okay, my control." They reached 100 knots, about 185 kilometers per hour. Everything seemed fine, and the plane was seconds away from takeoff. Until suddenly, a dark, giant shape appeared ahead. The captain had his jaw dropped and barely had any time to react. Within a split second, the first officer realized they had taken a wrong turn back at the N1 junction, and that sealed their fate. Before anyone could stop it, the plane slammed into construction equipment that was left on the closed runway at nearly 200 kilometers per hour. The impact was too violent to imagine. The right wing broke apart as it hit an excavator, and a raging fire burst out instantly. The nose gear collapsed, and the plane tore across the concrete, scattering debris everywhere. The cockpit was totally in flames, and then within seconds, the entire jet was taken by fire. People inside screamed for life as smoke filled the cabin. The flight attendants rushed to open emergency exits, but parts of the plane were heavily damaged. Inside, it was chaos, but not fire. Bags and seats were scattered everywhere. Some people were dazed but alive. The cabin was tilted so sharply that those on the right side fell across the aisle when they unbuckled their seatbelts. The emergency slides opened backward into the cabin, blocking exits. The left doors were pressed against the ground. The right ones were too high to reach. So passengers began climbing toward a hole in the broken fuselage. One by one, they escaped through it, stumbling into the torrential rain. That way, only 54 people in the tail survived, but 83 lost their lives. Amidst them were 79 passengers and 4 crew. Most of them died in the front part of the plane, near where the impact had happened. Only 96 people survived, some with severe burns and injuries. When rescue teams arrived, the scene was horrifying. The tail section was the only part still recognizable. The rest was twisted metal, flames and thick black smoke rising into the storm. Investigators later found that the plane had hit several construction vehicles parked in the middle of runway 05 right. The impact forces were so strong that the right wing broke into 3 pieces. How could this happen? The investigation began immediately. Taiwan's Aviation Safety Council, or ASC, took charge. At first, some thought the typhoon's winds had caused the crash, but data showed that wind speeds were within safe limits. Others believed maybe the plane struck something on the correct runway and then veered off. Singapore Airlines insisted its pilots couldn't have been that careless, but soon evidence told a different story. Photos showed wreckage lying squarely on runway 05 right, which was the closed one. Investigators found tire marks proving the plane had rolled its entire length there. The flight data recorder confirmed it. There was no doubt anymore. Flight 006 had tried to take off from the wrong runway. Why? The answer was painfully human. The confusion was caused by poor visibility, unclear markings, and misleading lights. The closed runway's lights were still active, and there were no proper signs or barriers at its entrance. The pilots had done what seemed logical in the storm. They followed the lights and markings they could see. But those lights led them straight into danger. And during that time, every clue that could have corrected it, like the unopened PVD shutters, was dismissed as a minor glitch. When Captain Foong shouted something there, it was already too late. At that speed, no human could save a 400-ton plane hurtling through the dark. But if we dig deeper, you will see that it was not the first flight that made this mistake. Just 8 days before the crash, a cargo plane pilot had noticed this very problem. He had told investigators that when he was taxiing at night in the rain, the curve leading to the runway 05 right looked so bright and inviting that he almost turned there by mistake. He said he felt compelled to turn right because it looked like the active runway. But at the last second, he realized something was wrong. Because the runway was narrower than expected, the lights were green instead of white, and it didn't have special touchdown zone lights that are used in poor visibility. That day was much clearer and visibility was not too bad, so he avoided disaster. But his warning wasn't acted upon quickly enough. The Taiwan airport didn't take any serious action to rectify that confusing situation of the closed runway. Some clues could have warned them at the N1 junction, though. A sign marked 05R stood at the turn, and the number 05R was painted on the ground. But once the plane completed the turn at the junction, those signs were no longer visible from the cockpit, because they were behind or beneath the aircraft. Now you might wonder, how did 3 pilots together miss those vital signs? From the aviation perspective, it's not unnatural. Every pilot handled different tasks in a plane. In this flight, too, the first officer was checking instruments. The relief pilot was recalculating crosswinds, so both were looking down at their controls when the captain alone made the turn. By the time they looked up, the plane was already in position. From their view, the runway ahead didn't look wrong enough to question it. There were no visible barricades, no markings that screamed danger, and the rain blurred whatever faint details might have hinted otherwise. The only noticeable thing was, inside the cockpit, the pilot's screens were also showing odd readings. On the primary flight display, a small magenta diamond and the runway symbol were both shifted far to the left, suggesting that the plane was not lined up correctly. The pilots could have taken this seriously, but they didn't. Why did they miss all these signs? Because the human brain tends to see what it expects to see. The crew believed that the closed runway would look obviously closed, like dark, barricaded, or marked with a big X. So when they saw a runway that was lit and looked active, their minds simply accepted it as the right one. There was also confusion over the edge lights. These lights run along the sides of a runway. Normally, if a runway is closed, the lights are always turned off. But investigators found out that the edge lights of 05 right were on. If they really were, that would have made it look even more like an active runway. However, security camera footage didn't show them, and the investigation later couldn't confirm for sure. Some wires showed burn marks, meaning they had carried electricity, but that might have happened when rescuers turned on all the lights after the crash. So during this little room for confusion, the exact truth was never fully settled. It was a tragedy born of confusion, routine, and trust. Trust that the lights ahead meant safety, and that a missing signal was nothing to worry about. Singapore Airlines had never faced a tragedy like this. For decades, its record was spotless, but this one mistake made in seconds stained that record forever. Naturally, the Singaporean investigators later argued that this setup at the Taiwan airport violated international rules. If a runway is permanently closed, there must be clear markings and the lights should have been removed completely. But the Taiwanese authorities had not yet formally redesignated it as a taxiway, so they kept everything as it was. They believed it was technically still a runway, but not operational. That legal gray area turned out fatal. The Singaporeans called this decision short-sighted. They argued that keeping both ends open while blocking the center was asking for trouble. It created a deadly illusion, a runway that looked real but wasn't. In the end, both Singaporean and Taiwanese investigators agreed on the main facts, but disagreed on who was more at fault. The aftermath was painful for everyone involved. Since there was no sign of mechanical failure, and there was no storm strong enough to blame, the investigators concluded that Flight 006 crashed because of a simple navigation error by pilots, compounded by bad weather, poor visibility, and subtle design flaws at the airport. As a result, the pilots were held in Taiwan for weeks, threatened with criminal charges. Later, manslaughter charges were filed but eventually suspended because of their clean records and the difficult weather that night. Still, Singapore Airlines fired both Captain Foong and First Officer Latiff. Many pilots' associations called it unfair. Eventually, both men found work again at AirAsia and continued flying until they retired. Out of the tragedy came major changes. A new module of training was introduced at Singapore Airlines. Taiwan's airport authority redesigned taxiways, improved lighting, and followed international standards more strictly. The old 05 right was permanently closed, and new warning systems were added to help pilots confirm their correct runway. New technology also emerged, like cockpit moving maps and takeoff runway disagree alerts that tell pilots when their position doesn't match their assigned runway. Runway guard lights, bright flashing beacons meant to alert pilots to an active runway ahead, were installed where they should have been all along. Today, aviation is safer than ever, but incidents like Flight 006 still remind us that perfection doesn't exist. Even the best pilots can make simple mistakes, especially when human senses are fooled by misleading cues. The night Flight 006 tried to take off from the wrong runway wasn't just about technical failure. It was about how small oversights, like a few misplaced lights, an unchecked sign, and an assumption, can come together to create disaster. And that's what makes this story unforgettable. Do you think it was pilot error, or a system designed to make failure inevitable? What would you say, considering how the Singapore Airlines treated its 3 pilots? Was it right to fire them or not? Tell us what you think, that who was truly at fault here, the pilots or the airport? And if stories like this make you rethink what safety really means in the sky, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real stories that make you question the truth behind the headlines.